Picture this: a crumbling Italian mansion in the Tuscan hills, an eccentric aristocrat, sun-soaked lunches, too much wine, and a house humming with secrets. That's the delightful world into which we're heading today as we talk to writer Andrew Sean Greer, whose new novel, Villa Coco, is loosely inspired by his own time at an Italian estate around a famous baroness. I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, featuring weekly in-depth conversations with fascinating people. Greer, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Less, joins us to discuss his life in Italy, the pleasures of the charm novel, and the one piece of travel advice he always comes back to. Today's episode is hosted by books editor Melanie Kembrey.
Thank you, Conrad, and welcome Andrew Sean Greer. It's lovely to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Andrew, your characters across your novels, they tend to wander through the world with a kind of what I think of as elegant panic. Is that a state you recognise personally?
I don't know why you would say that. I was just talking with my mother yesterday about that and how it runs in the family. Maybe not elegance, but panic for sure.
But the thing about these people are your novels are so tender towards these characters who are a bit lost or ashamed. And it's a really kind of nice counterpoint to a world obsessed with kind of self-optimization. What else draws you to these characters other than their familiarity with your own self?
Well, I think there's something very sweet about that kind of vulnerability and sensitivity to the world that I think we often see online as anxiety or panic or something that needs to be solved. And I think maybe it's because I'm a writer, I find it's sweet that they're open to new experiences or to new people, even if they react to them, that they're not going forward with a set plan and personality that they're going to force on the world through will, but they're open to an emotional response, and therefore open to a joyful response.
Which brings us maybe to Jeffrey, who is at the heart of your new book, Villa Coco. Tell us about Jeffrey.
Well, he is an American who has finished college and has decided to take his parents' advice and to begin to take life seriously. So he accepts a job working in Italy for a Baroness as an archivist, which seems like the most mature way of having a sort of ordered life. And he gets there, and it is anything but.
I loved the world of Villa Coco. In fact, since I've read the book, that's where I want to be there right now. I want to be at the Baroness's crumbling manor estate with all the eccentricities and delights of it. And it is based on a real place and real experiences. So tell us about the first time you met Baronessa Beatrice Monti.
Well, I was just there yesterday, in fact, because there's a prize ceremony that she gives and a big luncheon. I first was invited to Santa Maddalena Foundation in 2005, and it was not just the arrival in Italy, which I think a lot of us Anglos arrive and find it a different culture that's eye-opening and full of pleasures and sense, but also a world of art and literature and history. I realized the depth of my ignorance, something I realize all the time here when I turn the corner and I don't know what saint that is or what year it was. And I realized the very narrow American world I lived in, and that I had to open myself to all of those things, but also to charity shops and strange food. I will be served eel, all of it. I just had to break open my preconceptions, and that was really life-changing for me.
And the Baronessa is known for these famous writing retreats where some of the most famous writers in the world have visited, including the likes of Zadie Smith. What did you make of her when you first met her?
Well, it's very tempting to talk about Beatrice in terms of this book, and she is a more extraordinary character that I could never hope to capture in a novel. So the character of the Baronessa in the novel is mostly sort of the sense of comedy that I learned from her, and a sense of lightness, despite someone now 100 years old who'd lived through war and difficulty and all personal trials we go through, of learning how to make everything into a funny story, which is something that the character in the novel teaches our protagonist, because he is still young and has unprocessed stories and complaining about things. And at one point, he tells her a story and she says, "This is not a very funny story. You must tell it to me another time." And it takes him a long time to understand what she means is, could you process it for me a little bit and then tell it as a funny story? And then you will have learned something yourself about that life moment rather than just the complaining part of it, which is not the most charming way to be in the world. And that is something I definitely learned.
And yes, as you mentioned, it is a novel inspired by her, but definitely a fictionalized version. Were you nervous about writing a novel that was inspired by real life and your real experiences at her place?
Well, I have to say that the secret of novelists is that they're all, of course, based on real life, but in a way that the subjects that we've taken from when they read them, I've learned this from my own mother, for instance, they never recognize themselves because it's never really them and the way they see themselves, because someone else's head is on their body. And we do this awful Frankenstein, um, taking different parts to work towards our own themes and plot, so that by the end, the people who we think must recognize themselves never would. Um, so, and because it's an homage to not just to her, but to that time in my life that's still ongoing. I'm talking to you now from Venice, where I live. Um, I I just knew that everyone who would recognize parts of themselves would realize the joy that all of that has brought me, and would, I think, be tickled. And a lot of people have read little versions of it here in Italy, and they're all, I think, delighted.
I can imagine they would be. And for listeners who don't know, after you went to the writers' retreat a few times, you ended up going back to run the foundation yourself there. Tell us a bit about what that role involved and how that kind of has influenced you as a writer.
Well, I came as director, because the Baroness, she turned to me and she's at her 90th birthday and said, "I'm beginning to go on in years. Um, I think I may need someone to help me." Now, she's still running the foundation at 100. So for me, there's a difference between visiting a place for a few weeks and actually living there day to day and doing the shopping and um, fixing the electricity and putting wood into the boiler for the tower and all of these, and talking to the priest and delaying him. And there's just the comedy of daily life was overwhelmingly funny to me. So of course I used a lot of those experiences. I decided not to include any writers in this novel, um, because those are private lives and people I love and admire, and I would never want to break that privacy, which is the bond of a writer's retreat. You know, you don't talk about what happens there except at a cocktail party. Um, but I didn't need them. There was enough already going on. And also, you know, my own inventions. It's everything is There's some stories that are somewhat true. You know, when I went to, I met a princess when I went there who, as in the novel, indeed could not understand, uh, she said, the American dialect. So we were unable to communicate, even though she was British, the way she was raised, but she only spoke what she called the King's English, even though Queen Elizabeth had been around for some time at that point. But she was quite elderly, so she called it the King's English, and we had to speak through a kind of translation. And I found that I'd never come across that before, and I found it amazing. Not just her snobbiness, but my snobbiness as an American, thinking everyone can understand American. Some of your listeners probably can't understand me right now.
It feels like it's a story that's in the novel and it feels like it should be fiction, so it's incredible to hear that it's a true story.
Absolutely true.
Were you taking notes the whole time? Like, to prepare for this novel, or just as your daily activity as a writer, or they kind of all came back to you, these memories, when you started writing Villa Coco?
Like many writers, I carry around a little notebook and I take notes. When I'm sort of turned on for working on a new novel, I I just take notes every day of what I'm doing. If you see a writer like David Sedaris, he is always taking notes on things he sees around him that you and I would never notice, but that he finds amusing. And there are the small details that make a difference. And I try to take notes, keep a diary, not of like, I'm so angry the package didn't show up. That's always boring to read. Or, I can't believe my husband didn't make dinner the way I liked. When you look back, that's never interesting. But if you say, like, I looked out my window and there was a woman with 5 dogs walking down the street and she was on her phone, like those sort of things, that's helpful for a novel. And so those are the kind of notes I was taking and that I'm taking now.
And that's a kind of way of seeing the world, isn't it? Of looking at the world. And Jeffrey, your character, when he moves to Italy, he's a bit uptight. He's the son of scientists, which I understand you are. And he kind of has to learn to see the story, as we were talking about earlier, that is there in front of him. Was that a journey you shared yourself as well when you went to Italy?
Well, I am the son of scientists, and so I was raised with a very structured way of looking at the world and of looking without peripheral vision, I would say. And I was talking with a woman yesterday she said her advice on the world um, for young people was to have peripheral vision and be aware of not just what you think you're supposed to do, but the possibilities that are all around you. And the second piece of advice she gave me was to have courage. And I thought, that is very familiar to writing this novel and what my protagonist is going through, because he's very focused on organizing the house and he's not paying attention to the fact that there's things vanishing from the house and things coming and going. And there's actually another plot going on in the novel that has nothing to do with him. Well, not until later.
And you said that you're in Venice too, so you live in Italy now?
I do. I live part-time in the States, but I'm renting this place in Dorso Duro, and for about a year and a half we've been here. And it's a delight. It is the greatest challenge of my life to live in a foreign place with a language not my own.
How is the Italian going? Because that is a plot point to Jeffrey, or Giovanni as he is known, he seems to be quite successful at it, picking up Italian. How is yours?
He learns it a little faster than I have, but I wanted in the book for it to start out that he knows nothing. So in fact, there's parts where it just says in brackets, Italian word, like he can't even pick up the sounds of it. And by the end of the book, he's functioning in Italian, which I recall kind of doing because Italians are very generous in listening to foreigners or non-Italian speakers try Italian. They always say, your Italian is wonderful. They've said that to me for 10 years, even though I know it was terrible. So they say it to me now, and I know I must be awful. But they love it. So I'm doing fine. Yeah.
And how does your life kind of day to day compare when you're in Italy to when you're in America? Do you kind of have the same routines, or when you go to Italy, is you're doing something different with your work and your mind?
I find being here, because in San Francisco, I've lived there for 30 years. So a lot of the times I have too much of a routine. And while I love it, being here is good for being very aware all the time and being a little scared, uh, which makes you more aware, which is the great state for working on a book, because then you pay attention to details, to people going by, to mistakes you make, which of course I make every day. Um, Getting lost here is common, and that's good for me because I, although as a writer I'm very dreamy, I need to be taken out of that dream and to look at the material that's all around me. And I find this a really good space for that, as humiliating as it can sometimes be.
And I mean, a lot of your characters in all your novels kind of have to go through a bit of humiliation, don't they?
Many people reach a state of humility through being humble, and I find I have to reach it through humiliation.
The word's basically in it.
Yeah, it's fine. I've accepted that.
Also across your book, which speaks to what we're just talking about now, is this idea of travel. And in all six of them, characters are either traveling countries or time. There's always a lot of movement. What is it about a character that stands still that doesn't do it for you?
Yeah, I've always wondered why I never write. I have always planned, like my book Less, I thought would be a book about a man just walking around his neighborhood, and then it turned into a book about a man traveling around the world. I think because it's too comfortable to be in your own little routine, it's hard for me to imagine the sort of surprises and possibilities and accidents. We all know that in travel things go wrong and that you were faced with the panic of whether I should freak out and yell at the airline counter or think, you know what? I've got 4 hours. I could go into the city. I could sit at the airport bar and talk to this strange woman next to me. There's all kinds of more amusing things than yelling at the airport counter. And that shift of mindset is what I'm constantly trying to learn.
You mentioned your earlier books, which I love, but a lot of readers would know you from Less, which won the Pulitzer Prize and had real international success. To me, there is quite a big tonal shift from the works that came before Less to Less, which is kind of, there's a greater comedy in your last three novels, including Villa Coco. Do you see that there's a significant kind of shift in your writing, and what prompted that for you?
Oh, absolutely. I wish you would not crack a smile in my first books. But I think that it took getting older. I think when I was young, I wanted to be understood as a serious literary author and part of an American tradition of serious literary work. And then there's a certain point where you don't care about that anymore. Um, and and I see it in a lot of certainly English language writers. Uh, you look at the John Updike and Philip Roth, and in England, there's a tradition of comic writing by literary writers where they're free, they're approaching the same material, but from the other side. And I think for me, it was not caring anymore about that gravitas and realizing that there is way to get to serious material through what's actually a little harder, which is comedy. And I think when you're young, comedy means being cruel and making fun of other people. And then when you're much older, you realize it's making fun of yourself, that you're the thing ridiculous in the world.
So it's still hard work, even though it's such a fun book to read. I like to think of you there laughing over every joke because every page has something to smile about, but it's not quite that fun to do.
I've got to say Villa Coco was a blast. Of all the books I've written, I wrote it the fastest and just enjoyed myself. Just because I think at this point, I think if I'm enjoying myself, then the reader can tell and they'll enjoy it too. Even if something doesn't quite add up plot wise, it doesn't really matter. We're here for the delight. And I think now I think about wanting readers to remember what it's like to have a delightful reading experience rather than just like an important one, which is of course great to reread War and Peace, but sometimes you want to be just charmed for days and released from the cares of your own life and of the world.
Yeah, talk to me a bit more about what you call the charm novel, because you wrote an author's note talking about how you wanted this to be a book that readers could go back and revisit, a world that they could enter. What do you consider a charm novel, and what are some of the charm novels that you were thinking of while writing Villa Coco?
Well, I'm going to seem very old-fashioned in that I think of these British novels that are like not the memoir by Gerald Durrell, My Family and Other Animals. Those books I could read endlessly, and you know that they're not true. he's invented and exaggerated, but it's just eccentric characters and a sort of absurd worldview of people thrown off by their circumstances, but who are there's a sort of sunlight to them, or the Nancy Mitford novels that are delightful, or Cold Comfort Farm, um, or I Capture the Castle. There's sort of like children's books for adults in the sense that they're delightful from beginning to end, even though they deal with serious things about death and grief and the passage of time. But they can, like the Baroness taught me, they can make a funny story out of them. And I find that those are the books that we really go back to, or I go back to year after year. I don't reread War and Peace every year, but I sure reread I Capture the Castle.
Do you think contemporary fiction has become too cynical?
I don't know if I have any opinion about that, but I'm not that plugged into contemporary fiction, because I'm so focused on the book I'm working on that I'm reading the books that inspire me for it, that I'm often trapped in the past. Uh, but I also think that we need every kind of fiction. We need fiction that riles us up. We need fiction that makes us cry, that makes us take action, that makes us look at our lives, and fiction that makes us laugh. So I'm not here to replace or admonish other books.
The question I was next going to ask, which might have the same answer, is I thought it was quite nice to read a book with a nice plot to it. I feel like plot has also dropped out of a lot of contemporary literary fiction these days.
I do have a friend who often has said, um, almost every book is made better with a diamond heist. Don't you sometimes you're like, what a wonderful group of characters sitting around this table, but if they were plotting a diamond heist, it would just be perfect. I often feel that way, that really something should happen. It's kind of, well, you think about the delights of fiction, and and there's description and poetry and language and philosophy and character, but there's also events. You think about telling a story to a friend, uh, there's got to be something happens during it, right? Otherwise, you're just talking to your therapist.
Which doesn't make for the most entertaining works.
Not really. It's like telling someone your dream. No one cares.
Other than those paid to. Taking you back, you mentioned that this book was the fastest novel you've written and you really enjoyed it. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think this one came so easily? And was there any kind of concern or pressure in your mind after the success of Less and winning a Pulitzer?
Luckily, the first person I talked to after I won a Pulitzer, which is now 8 years ago, was the writer Michael Chabon. He's the one who told me that I'd won a Pulitzer because I was in Italy. I didn't know when the Pulitzer happened. So he called me, and he had won in, I think, 2001. And his advice was, now you can write anything you want and you don't have to worry about it. And I remind myself of that. I can write. So the first book I wrote was a sequel to Less, even though my agent said no sequels. But I still had more. So I wrote it. And then this one, I thought, I'm going to write the lightest possible novel I can, because that is the book I wish were on my shelf. And I think it's Toni Morrison who said, there's a book that you wish were on your shelf and you are going to have to write it yourself. And she wrote more serious books to fill that space. And for me, it was a book of delight and charm, which made it really fun to write.
Was it emotional at all, revisiting some of those? I mean, it would have been some 20 years since you had first gone to Italy. Was it emotional revisiting some of those moments?
Yes, I think what always happens to me with a novel is I write the first draft with events and stories and characters, and then I go back, I read it, and I think, okay, once more with feeling, Andy. The emotions, I always have to go deeper. And that's the emotionally hard part. Even though these are comedies, I have to go back and think a little deeply about hard memories of mine and give those to the characters as well. Even though in a comedy you do it very briefly, you touch on the really hard stuff, but you have to do it perfectly. That's what I've learned is the difficult thing. In a more serious book, you could have pages and pages and pages about death, but in a comedy, you talk about it once perfectly, and that's actually not harder, but a different technique.
Yeah, of course. And when you write out, what's your kind of process in terms of getting that balance right? Do you do you do a chapter and constantly revise? Are you long form by hand and then type it up? What's your kind of working process?
I'm a typer. I do have friends who write longhand. People my age still write longhand and legal pads. That's a great way to write, I think. But I was not taught writing correctly. I was never corrected, so my hand cramps up. So I like to wake up very early in the morning, especially if I'm here in Italy, because then the news from the United States, I don't get it for 6 hours or so. So I'm free of that. Uh, and I can just work all day until noon or so and enter it into right out of sort of a dream state and go into writing. And I will go and here in Venice, I'll go to one of the libraries where everyone else is working, which keeps me focused. You can't watch Instagram videos in the library. You have to be working in some way. And I find that really focusing. But a lot of it is waking up early in the morning, uh, 5:30 or 6, and going straight to it before the day starts distracting you.
Mhm. You mentioned the American news. Is part of what's going on in the world at the moment why you so desperately wanted a book like this on your shelf?
For sure, of course, I started writing this before our election, but the world is already in a difficult place. And it's not that I foresaw we would need this a delightful book at this particular awful moment. Uh, I just felt it in myself that that's what I needed to do because I did find myself avoiding the American news already or in the world news. Um, Although you get the world news right away here when you wake up.
Can you understand it in Italian yet?
Yes, my reading is not as good as my listening because there's a sort of more complicated written form. But yeah, I read the Italian news, but that's also humbling because you if you read when I read the Italian news, I discover how little American news is part of it and how little is actually that important to people in other countries. These little details of which senator said what to another senator, not important in the way that they certainly have their own representatives here in Italy saying things every day that you could really get obsessed with, except they're also not important because the news wants you to freak out every day. And I try to stay away from doing that.
I like that. That's the kind of active resistance is to maintain calm.
Yeah, that's my part in the resistance.
We've circled a few times around kind of at the core learning for your character, Jeffrey, and at the heart of this book is this idea of the power of story and how grief can be transformed through story. That is such an optimistic, uplifting view of literature. Have you always felt that way about words and writing?
I've certainly, well, the reason I'm a writer is because I was such a reader as a kid and felt it so transformative. I think I was just taken aback by books like, for instance, Wuthering Heights, of all things, was really, I myself didn't know anything about passion. And then when you're 15 and read Wuthering Heights, you think, gosh, this is out there in the world. I can't wait to experience that. Later, you're like, I don't ever want to experience what they're experiencing in Wuthering Heights. But that there's these um, emotional states that that are belong to other people, to the writer, or at least to the characters that you can take part in as a reader. You can think with someone else's mind. I always loved that, and so it's sort of you start off as a sort of fan fiction writer. When you're a writer, you want to take part, see if you can produce it in other people. and first you're thinking only about yourself, but later when you're a professional writer, you think about the reader and you hope that you can create some state in them. And that's why I want to create this sense of, if I could take them to like a sunny Tuscan villa, with comedies and secrets and hopefully some wisdom, that would be a real win.
And I know you did intend to write a sequel to Less, and then you weren't done with The Voice. Do you think any chance we could see a sequel or some of the characters having side novels for this one?
No one's asked me that. I definitely won't write it next. My agent would be appalled. But I loved these characters so much, and as I said, they were inspired by real life, but then they became their own characters for me, so that I can imagine things that have nothing to do with memories I have and taking them forward on them. That would be delightful, but not yet.
It could be the Durrells. It could be a new a new series. I think a lot of readers will want that.
That would be great. Let's see.
Also, you don't need to worry about the agent. Just whip out the Pulitzer.
You're right. I can write whatever I want.
Just to finish us off, I have to ask, Baroness Beatrice, has she read the novel, and did she offer any fantastic quotes about it?
The one thing she said was, "Where did you get this Coco? Who is this Coco?" People never recognize themselves. And of course, it isn't her. But I think a lot of people around her have read it, and I recorded reading it for her to listen to, and gave her copies. And everyone who I've been inspired by them, and they're in my books. I think it is, again, it's unnerving to see how you've been changed, and I think that's a strange experience. But I think it must also feel delightful. It's never happened to me yet, so I'm curious what I would think. But I think it's flattering in a way, right? That you're enough of a character to become a character.
And surely enough writers stayed at the retreat when you were there that you're going to kind of filter in the periphery of some novels.
Oh my gosh, me? Let's see. I can't wait.
To wrap us up, Andrew, I'll ask you one more question, though I'd love to keep talking to you about these lovely sun-drenched Italian days. But what would you say to younger Andrew first showing up at the estate in Tuscany all those years ago?
I would say you brought the wrong suit. I just remember packing like a black wool suit for July, and I thought, oh, I'm sure I'll dress up now and then, but you dress up all the time here. So a black wool suit. I did go to a funeral. It did come in handy for a very famous artist, but I needed some more suits. Yeah. That's the first thing.
Pack carefully. It's wise advice. Andrew Sean Greer, thank you so much for joining us on Good Weekend Talks today.
Thank you so much for having me.
To enjoy more in-depth journalism from the latest edition of Good Weekend, visit us at theage.com.au or smh.com.au. This episode was produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mumry, with technical assistance from Taylor Dent. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills. Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick oversee our podcasts, and Melissa Stevens is the editor of Good Weekend. If you enjoyed this episode, follow our podcast and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. And thanks for listening.